So today I'm going to be looking at drug takers' perspectives on policy and the law. And the presentation today combines two projects which explore the kind of various functions of drug use, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So I've conducted, since 2011 up until now, the interviews are ongoing, one-to-one interviews with people who take drugs, and it's included questions about drug policy and the law. I was very interested in people's motivations, people's meanings of drug use, where they get their information from, where they source their drug use from. But I did ask about drug policy and the law, and it's been quite interesting to see that kind of how opinions have kind of formulated and changed over the years that I've been doing those interviews. So, there's two projects. So the first one was my PhD project, and that was, I interviewed 26 adult recreational drug users who were otherwise conforming citizens. Now that was to mean that they had jobs, they were parents, they had kind of positive relationships with others, and that was really to kind of show that drug taking isn't just something that young people do. Recreational drug taking isn't something that just young people do. And I wrote a paper on that, a bit of a shameless plug there, called Functional Fun. And really that people legitimise their drug taking by saying, well, I work hard so I play hard, kind of thing. So project 2, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, just because the types of drugs that people are taking and the functions are probably more in line with this conference, and it's also the project I'm working on at the moment. So I've up until now done 34 interviews about functional drug use beyond leisure and recreation. So something that I found from my first participants was it really was a recreational activity, and it was work hard, play hard. And I wanted to look at drug use beyond recreation, and I'll talk about some of the reasons in a little bit more detail in a moment. So for this project, I wasn't so interested about age. The first project, people had to be over the age of 30, not 13, 30. So it did have a broad age range of 21 to 61. They were equally split between males and females in both projects, and were predominantly white British in both projects. And I'll talk about why that's probably significant a bit further down. So how I got in contact with people was snowball sampling through personal networks, Facebook, Twitter. I had my own website for the second project so people could read about it. So that's the website there if you wanted to have a little bit more information on it. Also visited societies and groups. So from those kind of personal networks and snowball sampling from there. So project 2, the types of drugs that are used. So things like modafinil as a study aid, psilocybin, steroids, Valium, MDMA, Ritalin. So a mixture of kind of NPS or maybe things that are associated with the new psychedelic movement, but also kind of the traditional menu of drugs as well, for lots of different reasons, which included things like self-discovery, enlightenment, creativity, pain and stress, often intimacy in relationships. And I'll just give you a few examples here. So I interviewed a door-to-door salesman who was taking 1p LSD, microdosing 1p LSD, just to make his life a little bit more easier because he found it very boring. And so, which I thought was a very novel way of doing that. Somebody who had lost he was 38 years old and lost both of his parents within 6 months of each other. Quite suddenly. He was also a regular cocaine user, would take cocaine every single weekend, and he went on a kind of ayahuasca retreat to try and deal with those two things. Somebody else who was in point ballet and doing yoga and would vape cannabis before that for kind of flow and creativity, and also because of the pain of being on the point shoes, she found that cannabis alleviated that. And people who were kind of microdosing MDMA to kind of improve their relationship. And I think that's what really struck me, was the very novel ways in which people were using drugs to kind of overcome certain things that we couldn't traditionally talk about as being recreational, which is what my research had been in up until that point. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about the law and the criminal justice system. Now, none of the 60 participants have been formally sanctioned by the criminal justice system. And that's not to say that people were kind of open with their drug use. Like, quite on the contrary, people were very discretionary about their use. So they wouldn't deal in public places, they wouldn't take drugs in public places or try and avoid that. And so there's lots of discretionary tactics there. They were also kind of private about their drug taking, so they wouldn't tell anybody. They would tell everybody. They would tell people in their trusted social circles. And there was some fear about kind of being caught, but it was also about being judged as well, and especially the kind of adults, and how this kind of drug user identity maybe didn't fit in with this kind of legitimate identity, particularly mothers as well. There was a story of a mother saying that, you know, to be a cannabis smoker, she would, you know, kind of have fears about what people would think of her as a mother. So there was some kind of informal sanctioning within the group. So sometimes disapprovals from family members, sometimes disapproval from friends or intimate partners. Some people kept their drug use completely separate from their intimate partnerships. And other people had partners who tolerated it but didn't really like it going on. And a colleague of mine and myself, Mike Salinas, I'm just finishing off an article now looking at people's conventional lives and how that kind of protects them from the law. Even though people may be more fearful about being caught or more fearful about how it might impact their lives, actually their conventional lives, because they aren't kind of pursued by the police, because people wouldn't see them as a drug taker, they don't fit in those stereotypical images, that actually protects them from the criminal justice system. One thing that I found interesting in terms of the project too was the kind of under the radar and not mentioning the drugs word, so not mentioning drugs, so particularly talking about ayahuasca and retreats. That drug, the word drug was actually resisted and avoided within the interviews and conversations. So we talk about medicine and healing and holistic therapies and drinking. So really avoiding that discourse there, which was something that I hadn't seen before. How am I doing for time? Okay, so policy approaches and directions. And this I have found so complex to try and analyse these interviews, because there are so many conflicting discourses within just one interview when people are talking about the law and policy. So the kind of broad things that I've got, and after listening to your presentation, Charlotte, I want to bring in privacy to one of the themes as well, because I think that's really important, and it's something that my other article did touch on. But these are the kind of four themes, the emerging themes that I'm looking at today. So there's a harm, welfare, liberty and control. And you'll see how there's kind of tensions within those themes and contradictions. So harm. Harm could be split into kind of two ways in which people spoke about it. So either protected by prohibition in terms of harm, or exacerbated by prohibition. So the ones in red talk about how people would say that prohibition harms the user in terms of adulterated substances, in terms of not knowing what's in that substance. So also the harms to society due to an unrelated black market, which people link to violence, which people link to untaxed commodities as well. So there was that kind of thing there, that prohibition was set up as a harm in itself. But then on the flip side of things, people would talk about the harm that could be caused if there was any kind of relaxation in the law. So more, you know, the kind of age-old argument that more people would take drugs and therefore there would be more people possibly subject to harms. And there was this real sense of people talking about safety and things being safe, and how there's absolutely no assurances in drugs being safe. And so that harm can never be eradicated. So it's a bit of a catch-22 for people. So this idea of harm, and we are really in this very kind of public health discourse at the moment where harm kind of comes out. When people were talking about harm, they were mainly talking about that embodied harm as well, so the harm to the user. So next is welfare. Now, welfare could be split up into what people felt was personal responsibility and what was state responsibility. So there was a sense that people should kind of moderate their behaviour from the interviews. So this sense of Even people talked about addictive personalities. So if the drug isn't for you and if it doesn't work for you, then you're in the position and you should be able to, if you can't handle it, basically, then you should stop doing it. So there's this sense of kind of personal responsibility. Also, I started seeing coming through in some of the presentations is this idea of clean living and people not wanting to take any substances at all or just wanted to reduce substance use to kind of natural substances in order to go along this kind of theme of clean living. So people shouldn't be too reliant on substances. So state responsibility then. There was also, people would talk about that they wanted better information and advice, particularly to look after people who experience problems. And there were people who, people talked about their drug use very, very positively as a whole, but people also talked about the kind of times when maybe drug use had got out of control, if they had particular problems with particular substances. So people could articulate that and said that they would like some kind of more advice. People would be wouldn't really want to engage in treatment services. It isn't a place that they think is for them, certainly around the stigma there. And talking about the medicalisation, we've talked a lot about that this morning, and this was, if drugs could be used to help people who have got medical problems, that was seen as legitimate. So really, overwhelmingly, the participant group could talk about that. If it's a treatment, then therefore it's legitimate and we should think about changing drugs policy. However, mental health was something that was still quite stigmatised. There was still kind of that kind of idea that drug use will exacerbate mental health problems. So some people could see that some people used drugs to kind of help with anxiety and depression, and other people, still was in this discourse of no, that would really harm it. So that was interesting there. And I think that kind of goes in with the kind of more mainstream ideas about mental health and physical health and how we deal with those. And then in terms of welfare, so money should be about treatment and not enforcement. Okay, so liberty then. So people believe that, unsurprisingly, you should be free to take substances. It's their body, it's your body to do what you do with, but then with this caveat of control, if it's not working for you, then possibly you should stop doing it. This idea of also plants that grow naturally in the ground, people should be able to consume those, it shouldn't be for government to regulate them. There was also the flip side of things about regulation and people talking about that regulation might actually infringe their freedoms, especially if there was kind of models where you could only get so many ecstasy pills a month or something, that actually this kind of regulation model could be seen to infringe freedoms and be too restrictive for people who take drugs very regularly and who want that kind of control over their own bodies. Again, this tension again around control. So people shouldn't be free to take substances in excess. So this idea of this kind of neoliberal idea that people should only do it to a certain kind of point and not if it's kind of interfering certainly with their economic ability to kind of be in the world. So if it affected their jobs or if it affected their ability to parent. Quite a few people talked about the kind of tight regulation of substances. So some people thought that ID cards would be a good idea to have in order to purchase, that there was an over 18s or only allowed a certain amount. So there was very varying levels, and this is how it's very difficult to analyse for me at the moment in terms of that. Also a sense that products, and I think we kind of touched on that this morning when we were talking about the, I'm pointing at someone who's not there anymore. Yeah. But this kind of sense of advertising, this kind of sense of, the alcohol and tobacco industries, and we've kind of obviously gone backwards with the tobacco industries, but in terms of kind of promoting these kinds of drugs. And this idea that prohibition means people don't have personal control over what they're consuming. So lots of conflicting discourses there, very, very dense and very, very difficult. So looking at kind of people's, what they thought should happen because of the law or their understanding of the law, that also differed quite a lot as well. Some people were ambivalent because the law doesn't negatively affect them. So these people would talk about from their personal experiences. They weren't affected by the law. They could get drugs very easily from their own social networks. They weren't the people that were being targeted by law enforcement. There was no hardline responses. So people who were taking kind of modafinil as a study aid or Ritalin as study aids found that there was no kind of information from universities, so there was no kind of hard line there, so people were kind of doing that. So Diane was a 61-year-old woman, our oldest participant at the moment, and she was using modafinil as a study aid. And so she says, I don't really know about the legality stuff, I haven't thought about it. She bought her modafinil online, it came to her through the post, she distributed it between friends. Some people might call her a dealer, but that's what, you know, that's what she did. So she thinks they should be available to be buy, but I'm honest, I don't know what the legal position is. I've no idea. So this kind of idea that they, you know, some people just don't know about the law, and I think that maybe if we could come as kind of drugs policy researchers, we might kind of take this as standard that people know what their rights are, but and know what the law is, but that's not always the case. Then from others, there was a sense of apathy because they're not attached to conformist lifestyles. So these were people who were really far away from kind of any kind of mainstream society. They might have no fixed abode or having communal living. They're healers, they're therapists, they're guides. And so mainstream lifestyles and the law isn't really relevant to them. Now, I'm not going to go through this all the way through, but Jonah, who's 36, healer and therapist, obviously all the names have been changed. He says, should the law be changed? I'm not sure. It serves a purpose on one level, but I don't know. I'm an anarchist politically, so freedom with responsibility. And he talks about alcohol. If he's drinking alcohol in his fight, he's not being responsible to his freedoms. But if I'm drinking ayahuasca, then I'm becoming the kind of person who's not having so many arguments with my girlfriend. So he says, I don't pay much attention to the law in that sense. I would almost say it doesn't apply to me. But I can speak on behalf of a lot of people in this work. We just don't take the law that seriously. So that's the other kind of side of things there. Now, there were people who were kind of interested in reform and would talk about reform, particularly around reducing the criminalisation of drug users. Would make those comparisons with alcohol and tobacco and their legality and the fact that they cause harms. And this was really, you know, emphasising these harms and emphasising that and the challenge and how that's kind of challenging. So Sian is 28 and she uses cannabis for stress and problem solving. And she says, I think this should definitely be decriminalised. I think it should be legalised and sold and taxed 100%. So she talks about the harm with alcohol. And she thinks it's the government holding back making any changes. And when, you know, she really centralises herself in this kind of narrative. For me, when I want it, I have to message around. And when I asked my brother to get it, he had to meet somebody in a public place to get it. And I just think I shouldn't have to be in this situation. There should be a better route to get access for it, which would make life easier for me. So this is really centralising the kind of self and centralising the drug taker. Then there was the other side of reform, which was kind of welfare. And this was where people were kind of more of a society and collective. And people who did their kind of had their own research into it were maybe a bit more well informed about the different kind of policy approaches other than prohibition. And these people I found were kind of politically motivated in general. So this was, you know, about drugs, but they were also kind of quite politically informed. And this was kind of positioned as in the more broader kind of economic and social benefits. And they were kind of quite willing to be public about their beliefs for kind of drugs policy reform, even if they weren't willing to be be known as a drug taker. They were willing to kind of put this argument across because it's for the greater good almost, rather than it's for myself. So Dominic, who's 24, he'd used a variety of substances to help with insomnia and to improve his productivity. So he looks at this and he thinks the rational option is to decriminalise. So fueling organised crime, trafficking, violence, and saying that the evidence is the war on drugs is nothing but an absolute failure. So that's in a more of a welfare approach. So you know, this is a very kind of complex and messy process, which we know that drugs policy is. There's lots of different arguments going on there. And I think we kind of, I think drug users need to be brought into this debate a little bit more. And hopefully Melissa Boner and myself will be doing some research into that to try and get drug takers involved. We saw a kind of support for reform, but a kind of a lack of activism that I found within. And people were kind of certainly worried about kind of putting themselves as a drug taker talking about drugs policy reform. You could argue it for the greater good, but to argue it for themselves was a little bit more complicated. And there was this also that I found that with some discourses having that neoliberal emphasis on individual decision-making choice and certainly blame around if things go wrong, although there was that social welfare from some people as well. And I think I want to kind of just point out the limitations of my research to say that I'd like to include a broader range of drug takers here. These were people who hadn't been in contact with the police. These people were kind of go under the radar, and maybe people who do have experiences of the treatment and the criminal justice service system would have very different views. And that is the end. So I'm still looking for participants. So if anybody knows anybody that might want to take part, then those are my details.